Okay, well, I guess we could get started. I'm here to see what is going on with hunting and fishing. This is a Haven Heritage Forensics program. This is a organization that started as the Haven Project in 2012, and uh, it was the place where all the tribes' information from their recognition petitions was stored for eventual use in the future. And it evolved more recently after 2019 into heritage forensics, which basically is a way of organizing this information to be able to use it to prove basically Abenaki legitimacy. So what we're going to be seeing today is kind of a hybrid. It's a case study in cultural continuity, yes, but it's also a bit of a story about my family and my growing up in a mixed Abenaki and a Euro-American hunting and fishing world of the 1950s and 1960s. So first of all, here's a picture of my family up at Highgate Springs on the Missisquoi. Um, and you can see that they have a pair of Abenaki paddles that are crossed in front of my grandmother sitting on the ground there. And Aunt Elmidi is holding a bamboo uh, rod, bait casting rod with a nickel reel dating to about 1914 to 1917. So my family has been on the water for several generations. So what we're going to be looking at in terms of the case study itself is northwesternmost Vermont. Okay, so what you're seeing here is basically the top of the screen is Canada, and about 4 miles to the left of the screen is New York State. So what you're seeing here is the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge, Highgate, and Swanton on the mainland. And you'll notice there's some little asterisks there. These are the spots that we have stories to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to combine personal history, personal family stories with it generalized, excuse me, information from other Abenakis in Vermont. Now, this is strictly American Abenaki. It does not include any material from Odanak or from Maine or any place else. Now, one of the ways that we can think about hunting and fishing is you never know. My family, every time you went fishing, you took a gun. And if you were going out for a couple days hunting, you took a fishing rod. There really wasn't an operational separation between hunting and fishing in those days. So there's my grandma up by the monument on Monument Road with my dad with a Stevens favorite, just in case there will be some squirrel or muskrat or something that might be able to be added to the pot. So the first thing we need to do is just touch a little bit on spirituality. In general, indigenous spirituality in this area is very proprietary to individual families or to individual tribes. But there are some bits and pieces of this that have become public, especially when it was necessary to share this with the state for recognition purposes. And so here we've got two quotes, one from Luke Willard and one from Roger Longtoe about hunting was spirituality was subtle. And up at Nulhegan, it was basically a moment of silence, so silent of prayer for the hunt, the technique itself, as well as the prey before setting off. And in El Nu, there was a tradition that was very widespread of bringing a piece of food or some form of honoring an animal after it had been shot. And so Chief Roger Longtoe shares that story here. And one of the things that's fascinating about Abenaki hunting is that it's almost as important for women as for men. So there's my grandmother um, with her Marlin Model 92 that I still have, by the way, doing some target practice with some other Abenaki ladies, dressed up, to just as if she'd be going downtown. to show the way that people honored their hunting. They went dressed. The men wore ties, the women wore jewelry and everything to go into the field. And on the left-hand side here is a fascinating oral history from a gentleman named Joe Bellevue, and talks about Bessie and Minnie, who were really old school, and they hunted with bows. They would stay out overnight, long periods of time, um, and they would forage when they were out hunting. And so it was really fascinating to read some of these old oral histories about Abenaki women in the field hunting, collecting, as well as fishing. So what I want to think about is, let's just assume we've got a hunter. Okay, they're going to set forth, and they could set forth in the winter, and they would require things like toboggans and snowshoes. Or they could set forth in the summer, that they would require a canoe and paddles to be able to get through. And then they'd have to have a place to live, they'd have to be clothed, and they'd have to have weapons. So I'd like to just go through this list and just show you some of these things. Some of these are strangely conservative, like bows and snares, and others are right up to date, like 1940s shotguns and rifles. It's a real interesting mix, showing this cultural continuity and blending that was a part of my world growing up. So we start with field camps and transport. Of course, the most important form that's indigenous is the bark canoe. And this is a picture of a birch bark canoe made by my stepson, Aaron York, a few years ago. And to lock it in, here is a quote by one of my colleagues, Steve Wheeler, who talks about his great uncle, Edwin Atwood, who just happened to have a set of birch bark canoes in his shed up until 1993. It's amazing. I would have loved to have gotten in that shed. And of course, canoe paddles. Uh, Missisquoi area canoe paddles are very distinctive. You notice the blade is long and parallel, and it has a semi-mushroom pommel on the top. And it's got a diamond lead. In other words, it's got this little ridge that you can barely see on the lower right canoe paddle. So they're very distinctive stylistically. And of course, Steve Wheeler, once again, his great uncle Edwin Atwood had a shed that had a whole bunch of paddles in it as well. I would have loved to see those paddles, but at least we've got two. And of course, the Abenaki Hunter's Pack Basket. And I love this short little quote from Chief Nancy Millette. Uh, Everybody had an old broken pack basket in the barn. And it's true. My parents had an old broken basket in the barn. I don't know whether there's any of them left that are whole, but this is one that's in really good shape that was from the middle of nowhere up on Averill Pond in the Northeast Kingdom. Snowshoes. At the bottom here, we have a nice quote from Chief Nancy, again, talking about going out on snowshoes in the wintertime, that they made themselves in the old Indian way. So not only the technique of making them remained, but also the fact that these were native. I intercepted for a very short period of time one of the last indigenous snowshoe makers in Vermont, in Fonda Junction. This is a little kind of hamlet in between Swanton and St. Albans. And when I was little, there was a gentleman that I didn't know at the time was Abenaki, but he made snowshoes. And here's my story about it. Um, and the reason why I remember this is my dad bought me a pair of snowshoes, and I'll show them to you in just a minute. In the 1960s, Swanton historian Ben Gravel, who never admitted to being Abenaki, but I have learned recently that he does have Abenaki ancestry, he said that it was an Indian relative of the Lapans of Swanton. The Lapans were a major Swanton basket making family. And the materials from that shop were bought by an antique shop, and I was able to get some of them. And the last bit of it I really didn't get because it was much too big, was a shave horse that was used to cut down the ash uh, bow of the snowshoes themselves. And I let it go about 3 years ago, and that's the last vestige of this native craft in the region. I did recover a few other things. This is a crooked knife, a very distinctive native style tool that anyone would identify as being a northeastern variation of the crooked knife, and that was used uh, at that shop. The snowshoe mold on the left came from the shop. Years ago, I donated that to Echo, where it's on display down in Burlington, and I still have a unfinished snowshoe frame with a ashwood hoop and maple crossbars. It's all set to go and to have its babiche or its rawhide lacings put on it. And this is the pair that I still have that was purchased by my daddy for me, and I've used it exactly twice. And I've discovered that I don't have the leg muscles to be able to properly do long distance snowshoeing. Another important thing was winter pants, in this case, a set of leggings. And this is a pair of moose hide leggings, um, probably from the 1740s, 1780s, that were converted to pants in 1810. And once again, we've got Minnie Bellevue over here making her own clothes out of deer hide. So you can see that we have the object, we've got my memory, personal memory, as well as other people, their little tidbits of oral history that weave this narrative of culture, cultural continuity. This is a fascinating piece. I found this at the antique show, big antique market down in Brimfield. There were about five of them for sale. This one looked completely different from the other ones, which were almost all Cree. There was one from way out west, but this one was wide. The upkick at the front was very shallow. But if you turn it over, it's got the indigenous style lashing holes on it. And you can see the dealer said this toboggan came out of a barn in northern Vermont. Never seen one before in all my years of picking, and neither have I. So, except for a couple Maliseet and maybe one or two Penobscot examples, these are the only ones. This is the only one that I'm familiar with from the south of the St. Lawrence River. And we've got one with a Vermont provenance. The next is now that we've traveled out to the hunting field, we've got the camp. And one of the most fascinating forms of architecture, indigenous architecture, is a junk hut. This was made by the Curtis family of Brownington, Vermont. It was built by memory by Chief Luke Willard back in 2009. And it's a expedient wigwam, longer. It's actually, if you look at it from the top, it almost has a teardrop shape. This will hold one or two people. It takes about 40 minutes to make. We did a time and motion study on manufacture of it, and it's nice and warm. It doesn't shed the water, but it's warm in the fall and in the spring. And in the wintertime, you can pile snow over it, and it becomes nice and toasty on the inside. Build a fire in the front of it, and it acts as a reflector to keep you warm. So what I want to do now is actually look at a uh, one of these camps, and this is the Charcoal Creek Indian camp that was well known in Swanton, and it was occupied by a mix of Euro Americans and Abenaki people, and a lot of good times were shared there. I'll show you some of these. So this is a picture of the West Swanton Indian camp. The gentleman to the right is my grandfather. The gentleman behind him is an Abenaki gentleman. One I can't remember which Lapan it is. I believe it's a Lapan. But if you notice, To the left, there's a fishing rod up against the tree, and to the right, there's some guns. And we'll actually do a little analysis of this picture a little later. Lots of detail in this. So you see that we can identify all the different parts of this. So instead of a junk cut, by the turn of the 20th century, a standard canvas wall tent was the easiest thing because you could roll it up, throw it in your canoe, and then set it up wherever you needed. And then, of course, in the back there's the canoe. There's the canoe paddle, the very distinctive hunter-trapper type of fire. This is the only type of fireplace that I have any photographs of used by indigenous people. There are about 8 standard Boy Scout fire lays, but for some reason the hunter trapper was the only one used by Abenaki. So I've got picture after picture of a hunter trapper. Then we got 22 caliber rifles, fishing rods, even an old Dietz kerosene lantern to round it all out. So there's a huge amount of data in this picture about what was used at that time period. This is another one. This is the West Swan Indian Camp. And once again, there's the wall tent. And you can see now we're doing some cooking. This is there's about 5 years between these two shots. You can see the tree in the background has actually grown a little bit. And I know where these camps are. It would be a wonderful thing to try to find them again and do a little archaeological survey to see what material is still left. These were occupied for about 40 years, as far as I can determine. Now, the fascinating thing here in terms of the hunting is that the gun that's against the tree there is a Winchester 3870. Now, that is a large game. That is generally, we would consider that a moose or a deer gun. And then you can see against the tree right here in front is a Marlin 1892 22 long rifle. So they're set for anything from a moose down to a chipmunk to be able to hunt. And of course, there was a lot of good fun to be had as well. This is my grandmother on the left-hand side with a bottle, probably of vodka. She used to like vodka. Pouring in. My grandfather's got a teapot. God knows what he's drinking out of. Bill Borden, and a Abenaki relative, has a can on the top. And so everybody's just horsing around. So every now and then, all the ladies will come in to visit the camp, and you can see everyone's dressed up very nicely. But fun was to be had by all. Often one with you see the young gentleman looking at the camera in the back saying, "Oh my God, what are these people doing here?" So generally young Abenakis were often went and lived here, and they were camp cooks. And some of I think Jesse LePan years ago told me about his father being a camp cook out here. He said it's an absolutely wonderful life. So now let's break it up a little bit between upland hunting and lowland hunting. So these are upland hunting weapons and tactics. And so bow and arrow, for some reason, even when people had single shot rifles, cartridge rifles, people were still using bows and arrows. So here's a couple quotes right here. There's once again Bessie Bellevue and Dave Hartwell from El New talking about growing up using bows and arrows. So there was a very studied conservatism in terms of indigenous technology that remained operational through the 19 teens, 1920s, 1930s, and even into the mid 20th century. Here's a good example of an early Vermont bow, probably 1780, maybe as late as 1810, made out of ash wood, decorated with red ochre stripes and still uses its animal gut bowstring. And once again, there's Bessie's quote down the bottom there. Now, one of the most fascinating Vermont and regional things is a bow. It's a recurve bow, but unlike modern regular ones that have the bowstring come from the bow knock, uh, these bows, and I have 5 of them now, and I don't know why, uh, put the bowstring through the bow stave. Can you see that, the detail? If you look up at the top, you can see the actual string comes out on the forward side, and then it goes through a drilled hole and emerges in the back. And you can see it also on the large one down at the lower right side as well. It's a very inefficient system. I don't know why it was used, but there it is. Years ago, when I taught at Johnson State College, I had one of my students that made bows as a hobby, and he made one of these and compared it with the through the bow stave and not. The through the bow stave was much less powerful than the regular recurve bow. So there's something going on with this. It's a mystery to me. But if you look at the picture on the left, a 1850s Bartlett lithograph, there's a gentleman there holding a through the bow stave bow. And if you put this under the microscope, you can actually see that the bowstring goes through the stave and engages the bow nocks on the outside edge of it. And interesting enough, to the lower right is a woman you can see with her hood. She is sitting there facing the other way, and she has one of these bows as well. Once again, reinforcing that idea of women as very important hunters. Now, the commercial ones that were made up at Odenak are shown to the right here, and those were a simple bow. It was not a recurve bow, and it did not go through the bow stave. Very, very different technologically, showing this huge difference in bow making to the north and the south of the American border. This is the only good arrow that I have from Vermont, and it's got a strange story. One of my students saw this in Montgomery in a bar in the mouth of a moose, and he came and told me about it. And I said jokingly, okay, purely jokingly, if you can get that arrow for me, that'll be a great addition to your project. Extra credit. He didn't get it that year, but it took him a while, but he finally got it and brought it to me. And this has a very standard, probably 18th, early 19th century conical bow arrow point on it, made out of a folded over piece of metal. The actual arrow shaft is made out of ash. The fluffy down at the bottom is a late addition. We have one example of a moose lance that was also given to me by a student. This was dug out of a garden bed by the students, one of their relatives. I don't remember now. And it's a perfect example of a probably 1780 to maybe, excuse me, 1810 moose lance. This thing was attached to a maybe 15-foot long spear and was used in the wintertime to kill a moose. Now we get into firearms. This is an example of a late Indian trade gun from a Essex Junction Abenaki family. A very poorly made gun. The interesting thing is that what needs to be in good, very sturdy, is it has a wonderful, a great octagonal barrel on it that is labeled London. It has a good lock on it, but the rest of it is made in the cheapest possible way. There's no finish or anything on the stock itself. And the butt plate and the trigger guard are made out of tin snipped pieces of tin. They were just roughly screwed on. So it's the absolute cheapest gun that could be made. And it was sold to impoverished, usually indigenous people in the eastern United States. This is a possibles bag from one of my relatives up in Quebec. I was able to get a photograph of it. This is a what's called a possibles bag that was used with one of these muzzle loaders. Now this one has a what's called a priming horn on it. This is a small horn that was used to prime the pan of a flintlock. So this was used with a flintlock gun rather than a percussion like the last gun that we saw. So this is the only example that I know of a indigenous possibles bag. This is a beautiful and really strange piece from Quebec, and within the Mohegan tribal territory. That if you notice, it's been carved almost to look like a bird. If you can see, there's the bird eye, and just below it, that one hole represents one of the two breathing ports in the beak of a bird. And it's got a lot of detail on it. I can't say stylistically or not whether this is native or not, but it comes from Abenaki territory, and it's a very strange form of scrimshaw. So I throw it in the pile for what it's worth. So once again, we come back to this picture with the guns here, and I still have them. So at the very top is my grandmother's fancy grade 1894 Marlin. My grandfather had the standard form. My grandmother had the fancy one that had the pistol grip and all of the checkering on it. And that's my grandfather's 3870. That's killed a pile of deer and moose all through the North Woods and even over in Oregon. This is my dad's Stephen favorite that I used also when I was a kid. So it's nice to have these old photographs of the Indian camp, and also to have the guns that are in the photograph. These are all very important links that make this story. Then a little bit later than that, of course, the firearm technology changed. And so the one on the top here is exactly the same action and technology as the 1886, but updated in the 1930s to make the Winchester Model 71. That was my family's moose gun. And then a modification of the Winchester Model 94, which was set up with a pistol grip and checkering and a nice sight on it. That's the Model 64, dating to about the time of the Second World War. And that was my family's deer gun. And for some reason, my family always cherished shooting woodchucks and being able to barbecue them up. My my father always said that the woodchuck had some of the sweetest meat in the entire world because they always fed on the sweetest of clover. And so there's my grandfather was 3870 that blew the entire interior of the woodchuck apart, so it was not very edible. There's my father and Roger Sargent, another old family from the area uh, in the 60s. And there I am with that Stevens favorite. And I think that was probably my second or third woodchuck that I ever shot. Uh, so even though they're a terrible pest in the garden, in the field, they are really delicious. And also, my grandfather said that a woodchuck skin makes the best drum head. So there's a little bit of trivia for you. Some other accessories. This is a canoe cup, which is a very important uh, Quebecois coureur de bois and native uh, article of accessory for hunting and fishing. Called a canoe cup because it was excavated out like a dugout canoe. This was made by Ned Hakey for me when I was a child in Swanton. This is my grandmother's Marbles 1920s Hunter Skinner knife that I won't tell you how many deer and other animals that thing is prepared uh, for the campfire. Here's a classic moose call, one of only three that I've ever been able to find in the whole uh, American Abenaki area. As soon as you get over into Maine, into Penobscot territory, almost every antique shop will have one, but they're very, very rare here. And they're built slightly differently with these constraining rings of spruce, excuse me, of bark and a distinctive way of sewing them up. So there's a little bit of difference on the moose calls over in this neck of the woods from the standard ones you'll find up in Canada and over in Maine. I love this one. One of my friends, Cody Hemingway, told me about making a raccoon uh, trap. He said just drill a hole and put some spikes in it. And I remember that from reading it somewhere, and I looked up in Frank Speck, Penobscot Man, and there it is. So there's no greater authority on Wabanaki hunting and hunting technology than Frank Speck. And there's this picture that is exactly duplicated by a young gentleman from Swanton, Vermont. This is a funny story from Nancy, Chief Nancy. She talks about when she was young, and she had a relative that was tasked with going out and getting something to eat, and he had a single shot rifle and one bullet, and he'd go out every night and come back with something, and you'd bring the bullet back, and everybody wondered what the heck was going on. So you can see, she says one night they went out to follow the older brother and spied on him. He's setting handmade wooden snares, old Indian trick, eh? And we would laugh. So there's a huge amount of detail. I could probably match this story with another three or four in terms of traditional trapping. Now, why did somebody make a wooden snare when almost every house in Vermont from that period had a stack in the barn of small game traps, steel ones? No matter how rich or how poor. I've been into very dirt poor farmhouses, and they had a whole pile of them in the corner. So once again, here we're picking up that conservatism, that almost unnecessary level of technological conservatism that the Vermont Abenakis have. Here's another quote from Elizabeth Lampman about exactly, making the traps themselves. And this was over in the northwestern part of the state. So we have redundant reports of this strangely conservative form of building snares instead of using leg hold traps in the early 20th century. Now we'll go down to the marshes to do some wetland hunting and trapping. Once again, the birch bark canoe. This is Aaron York, the bark canoe maker I referred to, and a Lake Memphremagog canoe from about 1860 to maybe 1900 that he actually did a lot of repair work to make it so he can actually use it in movies. Now, this is the darndest thing. This is a muskrat spear. And everybody that learns about trade goods, okay, especially in the upper Midwest, learns about the muskrat spear, which is basically an iron rod that somebody's taken a cold chisel and chiseled two, three, or four barbs on it, and then just taken the end of it and pound it over to one side. So when you actually lash it on a stick, it doesn't pull out. And so for years, I had just assumed that these were only used in the Great Lakes and the Midwest. But there was one in Irisburg. No explanation. It was just a local one, that was used probably on the BB Plain or maybe around Lake Memphremagog. No explanation, but there it was. It came out of an old barn. I was able to track it back. So it wasn't brought by some collector of Indian artifacts from Milwaukee. So that's kind of a geographic anomaly, but it's kind of interesting to see. This is a waterfowl arrow from Western New Hampshire. I'm using this one. We do have one other one from Vermont, but it's nowhere near as easy to see. So you notice this here has no fletching, and it has an enlarged head on it. The idea is to be able to shoot that from a canoe in the water at waterfowl. And the idea is that either will strike the bird in the chest and wind it, so it will crash on the water that your dog can go get, or it will hit a wing and break a wing. But the interesting thing about this is that since it doesn't have a metal arrowhead or stone arrowhead, it won't sink. And it has no fletching to get all messed up by the water. So the idea is after you are able to harvest your ducks and your geese, you just can go out and collect them. Interestingly, though, a lot of these will have bite marks in the center of them. So what you do, I guess you must have taken your old Labrador Retriever and sent it out and said, "Okay, go collect up the arrows." So you can just imagine an old retriever, paddling through the marsh, going and gathering up these arrows and bringing a whole muzzle full of them back to the birch bark canoe. I'm sure that people that study Native American art are familiar with the Cree tamarack bustle uh, decoys. Well, here's one that's made out of a black or river birch that doesn't grow up in Cree territory. And we have a story from Nancy Cote, probably the first effective chief in Nulhegan. And she has a story about when she was a girl, people using these. And I remember I was kind of skeptical about it. She kind of a short, feisty lady, and she looked up at me, arms, or fists on her hips, and said, "The goose, the decoy looks like a goose to a goose. Don't you get it?" So I remember that with a laugh. But later on, of course, firearms were brought in, and this is my family's Winchester Model 12 skeet grade 12 gauge shotgun with a adjustable choke on the front so that you can set it to either shoot ducks up close or geese in a distance. That's a very specialized gun that was used in very, very specialized hunting, aquatic situations. And of course, not only meat was harvested, and this is a Vermont Abenaki goose down basket. You can always tell one of these are they're huge, so they weren't imported or brought on trains or things like that from Canada. But they always have this big bell-shaped mouth on them. So when you were tasked with plucking the goose or plucking the ducks and stuff, you could just take the down and throw it into the basket and it will all roll down from the funnel and collect in the bottom. And this is what made your pillows, your comforter, and much earlier times, that's what was used for even making your mattress. But back when I was young, uh, these were only used for quilts. And I think I had one aunt that used down to make some small little lumbar support pillows. I remember that, I believe. That's about it. Okay. I love this picture. Okay, this is one of my absolute favorites. That's my grandma on the right with a, wonder what she was thinking. Can you see that expression on her face? And then Aunt Georgie off on the side with a smirk. So, so I don't know exactly, what they were thinking, but there's their fishing gear, and I'm not exactly sure what they were drinking there. But in terms of ethnobotany, the thing I find is really fascinating is that they made the traditional woven bug repellent headdress, and you can see them both with that on their head that keeps all the bugs away. But I want you to just think about something. Look at how they're dressed. Okay, Aunt Georgie and my grandma both have neckties on. You notice Aunt Georgie even has a belt with a brass, I guess, some kind of a decoration or um, a buckle. I don't know, but if you could imagine going hunting or fishing dressed to the nines, but that's what they did in those days. So that's my family there. There's a lot of settler writings about it. I don't want to really get into too much of that because I want to show you things because this is a PowerPoint presentation. So, Nulhegan Band and their petition, they talked about a very famous Abenaki gentleman. Unfortunately, the name had to be redacted, but was the foremost guide in the Lake Memphremagog area, and he was buried in Barton. And then a very important document from the Connecticut River Valley, okay, Middle Connecticut River in Vermont. Notice that they lived in conical wigwams and used these as a base from which to fish. So once again, we'll use this little model here of a fisher. When setting forth, will require transportation, shelter, weapons, blah, blah. Okay, we'll do this litany again. So here's another birch bark canoe made by my stepson with all the beautiful scroll work on it. And the fish camps, often the same, but this is the Metcalf Island Fish Camp. Now, the interesting thing is that the gentleman in the picture on the left, uh, I believe at least one of them, the gentleman to the left in the left picture, is a ancestor of Roland Bluto. And so uh, he's a Nulhegan elder. And so there's all of these kind of connections that were made in fish camp. And I love the picture on the right-hand side. There's a whole stack of different types of fish rods. Nice thing about these old photographs is the grain of the film was so fine that you can take that picture and you can put it under about 80 magnification in a stereo microscope, and you can actually get the detail of the individual fishing reels, and there's a gaff to pull out fish and all kinds of other stuff. The Metcalf Island fish camp is the asterisk at the very top, at the center of the Missisquoi Delta, just about a mile south of the Canadian border. And so once again, here we go. Here's the canoe paddles. And you can see over on the right-hand side, there's a fish rod. But once again, over on the right-hand side, there's two guns and a canoe paddle. And of course, the always necessary hunter-trapper with standard crane fire lay there, uh, and the ubiquitous uh, cedar and canvas canoe of the period. And this is the where the Missisquoi one was. Of course, cleaning fish. So this is that's a picture of me as a youngster with everybody cleaning fish. Uh, I was able to just hold the old lard tin there while everybody else was doing the nasty work. This is a very important picture. This is my dad. And this is a good shot of all of the equipment that was basically a middle class Abenaki and or other people in northern Vermont rig. So I'm that's the little Alto outboard on the Thompson Brothers 18-foot seater. Yeah, I know what it is because I was told about this all the time growing up. It was traded by the time I came on the scene. And we can identify all of the reels, rods, and canoe paddles and everything. Why? Because I still have them. Now, the important thing in this is you notice these pillows that are all over it. You notice my dad there is very young, big smile on his face. This is because he had just married my mother, a good Baltimore girl. And for their honeymoon, guess what they did? They came up. And so to make my mom comfortable on her first trip out on Lake Champlain to go fishing, my dad took all the pillows out of the house and put them there so she could be the queen uh, going out in the for fishing. When I knew her, she didn't need pillows that big, not at all. But this is just such a cute picture. I just had to share with you. And these are some of the river rats that those of you that read any of my books, I talk a lot about, especially the gentleman on the right, Monkey Drew, who taught me so much. But Ernest Laroque, the gentleman on the left, he was probably the most mechanically uh, adept person that I ever knew in Swan. He built furniture. I have a kitchen cabinet, a Hoosier cabinet that he made for my grandparents back in 1923. And he always uh, was a wonderful person that could fix a boat, anything that was wrong with that, could pull a motor, outboard motor apart, look at it, and always in his garage, always had the correct part to fix it. So I have so many stories and so many wonderful memories about these people. And just to show you, this is me as a kid with the Thompson 14 footer that I did all of this travel about. This is right on what used to be called Birch Island, just below. You see that rise of the land over there. That's the last rise of the land uh, at Clark's Bend on the Missisquoi, where the old Missisquoi Castle was. So we're ready to go out on the river and on the lake for a fun day. Huge number of traditions from all kinds of people. Dawn Macy, her We Met family was related to my We Met family. Um, and so she talks about her mom, talking about inherited interest in fishing. And Peggy Fullerton from COAS, this down there were all these incredible fishing stories and traditions about the narrows of the Connecticut River. And then Vera Sheehan talked about the same thing about the technologies when her father, Uncle Jackie, used to make show her how to make fish nets when she was a kid. And we'll show you some of those in a minute. One of the most fascinating fishing elements is this uh, oil-soaked clay concretion that was given to me by Monkey Drew. And it was unfortunate. Unfortunately, I was just a kid. I thought it was a kind of a weird, kind of dumb story, and I didn't pay attention at the time. I wish I had a time machine, but he told me that these were made by little people, and they did something, and I don't remember what it was, to control the river. And a couple of the other river rats talked about the little people, but I don't know any more than what I'm sharing with you today. And I still have this, and it was used, you know, by me all the time I was fishing. I kept it in my fishing box, and when I gave my fishing box to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, I kept this, and I still have it. This is a story by Chief Luke Willard about a fish drive where a whole cadre of young Mohegan people would get in a V-shaped flotilla of boats and go down, paddle down a river and drive all the fish before them. And they had rattlers. It was actually well coordinated. And there were Lance Sayers and brother Gordon and Jeremy Lacasse. They actually, uh, at the time, according to Luke, they were only in their teens and early 20s, but nevertheless, they established leadership positions to be able to organize these fish drives, which is a very, very, very traditional thing. It was maintained until they were threatened, literally threatened by walleye fishermen, Euro-American walleye fishermen. So they let the practice lapse. But now we still have, thank goodness, we have the memories of the fish drive still in operation. Here's an interesting story that Monkey Drew told me. And just to prove that I was there I am on the left-hand side with the muskie that I caught in the Black Pool back in 1960. So a little verisimilitude, or am I just trying to share my fish stories with you? Huh, I don't know. So back in the 50s and 60s, you used to go fishing in the Black Pool. And this is just below the dam at Highgate. And there's an aerial photograph of it. And Monkey Drew said that there was a mysterious beast uh, that lived in the Black Pool, and it would, if you were fishing for muskies there, it would grab your lure and just swim around, and you could stay there all day. You could try to pull it up, it wouldn't pull, and eventually you just got tired and you cut the line. So we had uh, this idea that this serpent was called Old Jingle Bells because there were hundreds and hundreds of musky lures and spoons and stuff all dangled from its jaw. And at the bottom here, I talked about getting goosebumps in the evening when I'd be out there fishing, usually for walleye at that time. And all of a sudden, you'd see this line of bubbles that was come up, and it was kind of creepy because that was a story that the old great serpent was down there and it might get you. Another tradition is shared by Steve Wheeler, a Missisquoi citizen, and he talks about his relative Edwin Atwood, who harvested fish not to eat but for garden, and everybody collected suckers. The white sucker, Cacostomus commerstoni, and they came up the rivers to spawn just at the right time where you could collect them and then take them up on the fields, cut them up and put fillets about the size of your open hand into a mound and it would fertilize. Here's some kind of weird techniques. Once again, this is Elizabeth Lampman Lepan talking about tickling fish. Just go out to the Missisquoi and get to a shallow spot and you just reach under the fish while they were spawning and bring them up. Ned Hakey had a fish spear with wooden tongs on the side of it. And this is an example of a absolutely classic Wabanaki fish spear. The one that Ned Hakey had, I saw that it looked almost identical to this one. Ben Gravel, Swanton historian, gave me a set of basswood fish handlines and net lines um, back in the late 60s. And I kept them all this time, not really understanding what they really mean. And they're beautiful. The quality of the spinning on these, if you look at that little batch of them up on the upper left and the upper right, look how fine those are. It almost looks like commercial twine. It's amazing. Amazing quality. And once again, here's Vera's quote talking about how to separate and make the fiber be able to be used. So we not only have the indigenous fish line itself, but we also have the story that goes along it. So we reinforce the story with the object, and we reinforce the object with the story. Here's Steve Wheeler's story about handline fishing. So this was the type of reel uh, that basswood line would be wound on. So this is a beautifully handcrafted one, probably about 1870, more or less. The fish line itself is standard squidding line. It's not native made, but at least it shows you what a beautiful handcrafted hand line would look like. And once again, with a story here. And so this is once again this strange reticence. So here's great uncle Edwin Atwood using a hand line when everybody else could use, at this time, even a spinning rig was available. So why? Why did the Abenakis deliberately choose not inefficient, I guess you could say, traditional conservative technologies when they went into the field? When logic would dictate, you'd try to get the most efficient techniques that you could use, any technology to be able to harvest your fish and your animals. Here's a couple historic fish hooks. The one that's on the top is a British uh, flared flatted eye example from early 19th century. And then here's a late 19th century machine-made hook. That actually is the hook that's attached to uh, that hand line that I just showed you. This is the darndest thing. Ben Gravel gave this to me, and it's a Julius von Hoff reel. And he said it was given to an Abenaki guide. He told me the person's name, of course. Duh, I forgot it. And he said, this is a really important piece. And he was trusting me with it. I didn't even know at the time, but this is a very, very highly collectible. Julius von Hoff was one of the great American innovators in developing the mechanical uh, bait bait casting reel, and this is one of the first ones. So this is an eminently collectible piece that no Abenaki would ever be able to afford in the 1850s or 1860s. So I'm so lucky to have this in the collection. But nevertheless, uh, this is the fishing set that came down to my family, and I don't know which one of the fishing rods that it is piled up against the tree in that picture, but it's one of them. And this is the bamboo rod nickel plate reel. And then the 1910 spinner, it's one of a bunch of them, but I remember my grandfather said that the tail on this was made by the deer tail uh, of a deer that he shot. So I remember that. So that's why I include it in the picture here. So it's always nice to have the old original picture and then the objects that are in the picture. And then when we're thinking about mid-century Abenaki fishing, these are examples. This is a musky rod up on the top and a very nice head split bamboo level wind rig. And then there's a picture of some of my family's fishing tackle that I didn't donate to the Maritime Museum. Oh yeah, just showing off. That's my biggest muskie. Fish trapping and netting. This is the darndest thing. Okay. Um, very stereotypic fish traps. The one that's at the top here was found in White River Junction. It was used probably on the White River. And there's a smaller one that's probably not for eel, but bait fish. And it was found in St. Albans. And I just got this one recently. Top one is now in Echo. But interestingly, we now have a story so important that links this up because people could say, oh, well, these fish traps came from someplace else. They're just imported. They don't have anything to do with Vermont. But Melody talks about Melody Macon talks about her grandfather uh, remembering these funnel shaped traps. And if you look at the one, probably you can see it the best, the one that's to the lower left. You can see that funnel right in the front of it right there. So there we go. Still using these things when you can use hand netting and things like that. What I consider unnecessary conservatism. But oh my God, this is one of my favorites. One of I loved Keith Wilbur's book, Indian Handcrafts. I read it and absorbed everything. And one of the most outrageous things in the whole book was this fish trap that's in the picture on from his book, Indian Handcrafts, on page 30. Look at that thing. It's got a figure four rig set up here so that when the fish grabs it, uh, the spring pole will pull it and lift it up. So I said, this must be a totally insane. But then here's old Elizabeth Lampman again. Dad showed me a lot about fishing by snaring. And the thing that I thought was the worst is what would you do if you were setting this thing and the thing actually snapped? It would pull that hook up at about 150 miles an hour and it would just grab you right, under your jaw or in your scalp or something. And Elizabeth Lampman says we would get caught a lot of the time. And so it's amazing. We not only have, you know, the a well, Keith Wilbur talking about this being an Algonquin Indian or native technology here. And then me thinking about, oh my God, that would have been the most dangerous thing in the world. And then here, right over in the Abenaki Research Project archives, is a woman talking about one of these fish snares and the dangerous way that it could catch you if you while you were setting it. So why? Why use all of this dangerous technology? That once again, that's that cultural continuity, and it must be a deep-seated driver in the way that Abenaki subsistence worked back around the turn of the century. Fish nets. So once again, here's the net line, and here's the net tying technology from Keith Wilbur on the picture on the lower left. And once again, Melody Macon is talking about her grandpa. Remember the fish nets. And I remember the fish nets too. And fishermen really hated those. And they would tear them up. And anytime they caught them, they were able to find them. And I'm sure that when I was a child and these were used, these are probably, commercial fish line that were woven to make the nets. But I couldn't imagine all the time and effort it would take to make the basswood fish net and then to have some jerk just, come and pull it up just because they were worried about the competition of the fish net. Ice fishing has its own weird things. Most important of these is fish eyes under the tongue. Uh, this seems to be almost universal separator. Almost every Abenaki, not all, but almost all, if you ask them, did you or your family warm fish eyes under the tongue when you were fishing? They'd say yes. And most Euro-American families, when you ask them, they'd say, oh my God, no, it's really gross. And so a few years ago, I asked Cody, next time you're out on the lake, would you pop a fish eye and get a picture of it? So there it is for you. That's a perch. This is a very standard ice fishing fish line. There's nothing distinct about this. This is different but from the Abenaki community, the Euro-American community. But we do know that this one descended and the Hillikers, a well-known Swanton Abenaki family. This is a fascinating thing. Homer St. Francis's dad had a fish decoy uh, that they used to tie on a line and put down through the hole and move it back and forth to draw fish in, either to be speared or to be caught on hook and line. And then if we look below that, this is from the Nulhegan ban petition. This is a small fishing spear, and the width of it is only about 4 inches wide. So this would be the absolute perfect thing to be able to stab down to catch one of these fish that would be brought up to a fish decoy. So we've got the story from Homer St. Francis, and we've got the example and the story from Nulhegan. So we've got it from Missisquoi, and then we have it from the Nulhegan area as well. Some other interesting stories from the recognition petition. And I don't know whether I really believe this, but sometimes I got told tall stories by these people and recorded them naively. But they didn't even use the fish hooks. They would just take the fish eye, pop it in the water, and then when another fish would come up to eat it, they'd pull it out, and the fish would leap out of the water. And they just take the fish that was flopping on the top of the ice, kick it over the side to let it freeze. And then we have Margaret Stevens. This is Don Stevens' mother, I believe. She's talking about the ice fishing with the fish eyes and stuff like that. And she gives more detail about keeping them under your tongue to keep them from freezing. So these are just a very quick and dirty synopsis of the abundant literature and oral history that's out there about indigenous ice fishing. And then to just end up, I want to let you know that the hunting and the fishing didn't stand alone. There were operational food systems that that process this and spread it around. And the picture here is taken on the front porch, side steps of the front porch of the house I live in today, with my great grandmother and all of my female great aunts and my grandma. And they all used to trade food over a very large distance from St. Armand to Sheldon to Highgate to Swanton. And my grandmother used to have these jars. And I remember she didn't, the food system was gone by the time I used to be sentient visiting with her. But she still had the cans, the jars. And I asked her why they were red. And so each person used to pickle or otherwise preserve meat and or vegetables and or wild collected plants. And they would put them in jars and trade them. So certain people collected ramps or wild onions, other people, pickled fish. But the color was so that my grandmother always knew to have people return the jars to her. So I guess each one of the sisters in that picture who traded with one another had individual colors for the tops of their cans. And so it's not just the hunting, it's not just the fishing, but once the stuff was brought back and processed back at the home base, it became part of a even larger food security, food sovereignty system that for some reason everybody talks about today. I give so many talks on food security and food sovereignty, but this is an actual example of it, operational. And so we need to think about, the ways that people solved for these issues back in the day. And with that, I'll stop. And if Eloise or somebody would like to give me some questions, I'd be glad to answer a few as long as my voice holds out. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. That was an amazing journey through time and space and traditional activities related to hunting and fishing, which really exemplify the way in which information is cherished and skills are cherished, and tools that may be considered obsolete by others who acquire them rather than making them might not value and might not preserve. And I have to express deep gratitude that you recognized and gathered the objects themselves and the associations with the people who made and used them. As I mentioned earlier, a few of the questions that were sent in during the registration period came to us, and I will share some of those questions that you can give some answers to.
Okay. I'll sit back and relax and
Yeah.
just talk now. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, rest your vocal cords for a moment. One registrant said, "I can remember my Abenaki grandfather catching eels. Are eels considered a favorite by Abenaki people?"
My grandmother loved eels. I hated eels myself. They were slimy, nasty, uh, and so I only can speak for my own family, and trust me, eels were considered a real delicacy. But interestingly, the technology, there were eel traps, one that woven trap that I showed you that is now in the Echo Connection collection. The hole in that funnel part is specifically the right size to let eels in. And one of the fish spears, the one that has the two um, kind of wooden guides on either side, was of the size that could catch eels. So there is not only this love of the eel itself, but there is a whole technology of spearing and trapping eels as well. So I would say if other Abenakis loved eels as much as the person that asked the questions family did, I think eels were very highly regarded in the community.
Thank you for that. Um, Another question goes back into deep time. What was the ecology like when the land was stewarded by the Abenaki people? And how is hunting part of maintaining that ecology?
Yikes.
Mm.
Okay. Um, I actually have 3 1-hour lectures just on that. So I've got to think about it. If we're talking about deep time, okay, we can go back Paleo-Indian if we want, with Clovis points. Uh, and the earliest type of hunting we believe that's in Vermont now was split between big game, in other words, things such as mammoths, mastodons um, on land, and marine mammal hunting in the Champlain Sea. And there were too few people to really modify the landscape at all at that point. There's a chance that if we believe the overkill hypothesis that human beings killed off the big game animals, there's a lot of controversy about whether that occurred or not. So that might be one large scale landscape responsibility modification that could be done. But generally, by the time we get to the archaic, about 8,500 years ago, and basically right straight up through the 1400s, there weren't really enough people to modify really the populations of game animals. There was a certain amount of landscape modification. There's evidence of pollen cores with charcoal in them, showing that forests were burned. maybe to provide successional plants that would be easier to eat by browsing animals such as deer and or woodchucks, of course. There's a certain, of course, when agriculture started coming in about 1,200 years ago, this completely shifted the population of animals. So they would start foraging in the fields because there were, uh, well, anybody that's ever does any gardening anywhere near a woods, everything empties from the woods to come in and chomp on everything from the crows, from the trees, blue jays, woodchucks, deer, fox, raccoons, everything. And so there's probably a modification of the distribution of the animal populations to adapt to both the presence of agriculture and the presence of large amounts of garbage, the middens that would be drawing people in, and actually establish the beginnings of domestication. So, for example, turkeys would forage a lot in Native American midden piles. And it's believed that's one of the reasons why turkeys and people started domesticating one another. Um, so I guess that would be what I would, a very generalized answer to that question. If we're thinking about deep time.
And really, when you are looking at cultural continuity that stretches back not just hundreds, but thousands of years, you can expect co-evolution. And the changes in the landscape had not only to do with the activities of the people, but also with larger forces that were gradually changing the relationship of land and water. So, yeah, it's a fascinating but extensive field of study.
Yep,
Um,
used to do that.
yes. And one of the questions that came in is, what is the best book reference for this? And I'm assuming this would, since those two questions came from different sources, um, we should take this to reference your hunting and fishing focus. Is there a particular book in which you have gone into some detail?
There's a
Yeah.
little bit of it in Voice of the Dawn.
Mhm.
That's published by University Press of New England. And I probably have about 25 or 30 pages in the book. It's still available from University Press of New England. And there's another book, if you want to deal with the archaeology of it, that has hundreds of pages of
Mhm.
information on hunting. It's called Reclaiming the Ancestors, that I
Mhm.
published by University Press of New England in 2005. None of the material I'm showing you here was in any of those books. This is all uh, more recent material that I am working now with Eloise and Vera to get these in forms that can be either as a YouTube video or actually written down. And we're also working to get the artifacts themselves organized and ready to actually go into a museum study exhibit area, so that people will be able to actually encounter these in the steel and wood, so to speak.
Yes, in person. Yes. And this relates to another question which came in. Are we finding artifacts in the tribal areas in Vermont? And I'm not sure the intent of the questioner. Often when people use the term artifact, they're thinking in terms of archaeological, but you have also been coming right up through the centuries into the mid 20th century. So you're talking about not merely archaeology, but material culture.
Yeah, well, you can see everything that I've talked about, all the objects, all the drawings, basically refer to the 19th and 20th century. When I'm talking about continuity, there's not a better place, okay, than the period from about 1900 to 1950 to talk about, because it's at the far edges of living memory. I can remember my grandfather talking about hunting and fishing, in the 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
Got it right here still. And so, and people like Melody talks about her grandfather with all of these things. So this is still, these artifacts and these technologies are still in living memory. Not for much longer. I'll try to hang on as long as I can. But we've got to get this information written down, photographed, documented, and kept for posterity. Because there's a lot of people that are beginning to wonder, is there any Abenaki history? Here in Vermont, you hear a lot of that on VPR and places like that. So it's so important. It's so important for us to get this stuff out, put a flag in the sand, I guess you could say, on the hill, to say that this stuff is here. We remember it, we honor it. And by the way, if you want to actually see it, it's right over here.
Mm-hmm. So we did have two questions that you might want to uh, mention, respond to briefly. One is who decides Indian identity?
Um, okay. Um, well, how I teach it, okay, how I used to teach it in my Native American classes, is identity is a negotiation between who I say I am and who society says I am. Okay. So when you're trying to express your identity, and of course, when I was teaching in school, all my students, they were awash in the latest tonsorial and sartorial fads with hair color and, things like that. And so what they were trying to do was express their specific individuality. And sometimes it would be accepted, and sometimes, it wouldn't. I had one of my smartest student was entirely goth, black, and it took her 2 hours every morning to put her makeup on before she came to class. And she had bells and everything, and very, very impressive intellect, very impressive soul in there, and a very impressive person to look at that pushed the edges of identity. And at first it was somewhat intimidating, but after I really got to know her, I accepted that. So the negotiation, you see, she won. She won me over. When we're thinking about indigenous or ethnic identity, uh, it's just basically that on a larger scale. Uh, the unfortunate thing is that um, uh, among all the minorities, Native people do not have the right of self-identification. In North America, dogs, horses, and Indians uh, have to prove uh, their breed by showing papers. And so, I could pull out my card saying I'm a registered citizen at Missisquoi, but you just can't say you're Indian. Unlike a person, as soon as one would say that uh, they were black or they were lesbian or bi or something like that, instantly all of the rights and privileges of that status falls upon them, and anybody that questions that could be basically hauled into jail for hate speech. But for indigenous people, that's not the case. So that's why it's so important what we're doing here. I talked about that, planting the flag in the sand, is that identity for Indians rests on who your great great grandmother had sex with, uh, what your belief systems are, and what you do. And I don't care about genealogy. I consider it magic. I consider uh, the actions, the beliefs, the artifacts, the ways of living that are distinctly indigenous is the signal that anybody should be able to recognize if they have a brain or they have a heart. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
And for people who are caught up in or exposed to and attempting to respond or make sense of these identity questions that have kind of taken on a life of their own in the media. The YouTube recordings from earlier sessions in this speaker series, there was a talk by Paul Rene Tamburo, and Joe Bruchac has a blog post recently on his Facebook page that go into some of the nuances of this. So if people want more information about it, they will be able to find some helpful reading material that presents a more balanced view and that looks at some of the legal protections and legal and cultural practices that are considered best practice in dealing with Native identity, and the fact that when state tribes are recognized, that's an act of legislation, and it should not be lightly contested on the basis of genealogical pursuits, which really should not be published without the informed consent of the family members. So we won't go into that further here and now. There was another question about how the claims of Odanak are having an impact on the Abenaki of Vermont. I don't know whether you want to take another moment or two to talk about that, if you feel that that would be appropriate, or otherwise we have one additional cultural question.
I'll take that one and the last one. I would prefer to speak for myself. There's an old Abenaki story that mosquitoes and wolves were brought into the world to perfect the animals that graze and walk upon the land. That before that, people were just accepted things. They were lazy, and people really didn't worry about that. And then the wolves and the mosquitoes came, and they had to really, all the animals and the humans, everybody had to really rethink who they were. And I like to think of this controversy as an opportunity. It certainly is an opportunity for me. I started off as a standard anthropologist, kind of ethnobotanist that adhered to what you would call scholarly research. Now, that kind of research, I don't even think about anymore. Because for everything that a scholar can say, you probably have noticed that very few new things are ever said in scholarship. You just cite somebody else that said something. So academics tend to be somewhat lazy. But when you have an opponent, in this case, parts of the Vermont media, that will, for example, if they take a look at this, they'll try to tear it apart, every little bit and piece, to find, oh, that fishing spear isn't exactly right. So what that does, it gives me the grace to spend the time, the energy to go into the nuances and the detail of the material 5-10 times more than I would have just taking a fish spear and say, oh yeah, there's an Abenaki fish spear. It's got the two prongs on the side. Yeah. Let's put it in the book. Now I actually have to look at that thing and see how it's different from the Penobscot one, and it is. And the woods were the woods on those decoys. They turned out to be black and river birch, which don't grow in the Cree area. So I would not really have to, if I was just being a museum curator or writing a book about these things, I wouldn't have to go into that much detail, but expecting every single thing that you think, everything that you say to bring a question, it gives you, it opens up these gates to detail and to really contemplating the underlying structure of the reality of these things that I really didn't think about too much when I was just a standard old, scientist back in the day. So now one has to become more of a Sherlock Holmes, uh, rather than a strictly scientist. And I find that that type of research, that level and that precision gives me a lot of pleasure. So, uh, and as far as, as I know, there really hasn't been any debate yet about cultural appropriation and exactly what is Abenaki and what isn't. So my work is developing an archive after I'm gone that of precision and as much provenance is the documented origin of an object, detail as I can find. And I find that I used to be woefully slovenly, but I'm better now, thanks to all. So that's one of the ways that I look at it. That's my spin, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, there you go. Um, and uh, we have an additional question of, would this information be similar to the Wolastoqiyik people of New Brunswick?
Certainly, much of it. Um, I think the fish spears, same. The concretions were used in that neck of the woods as well. There's so many things that are in common, but of course, I don't really have a chance to talk about the geographic distribution of these things. But no, I would say that you know the different types of traps, certainly the fish traps, the eel traps, yep, those go over there. The snares, yep, there are snares. Um, I don't know. There's a large number of books. Stephen Augustine did a big book listing the material culture of the New Brunswick Maliseet people, and it's got crooked knives in it. It's got snowshoes that are fairly similar, canoes, birch bark canoes. So I would guess that probably at least 80% of that traditional technology, not the guns, not the fish hooks, but the older, more traditional stuff would be shared. That's just a guess, but I've run into it all over the place, and I've actually purchased things that end up being Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Penobscot, or Passamaquoddy, thinking that it might be local, but after doing research, I determined it's more easternly Wabanaki, and it's put in that section of the collection. So I
Mhm.
bought a lot of stuff. Uh, and had to do a lot of study to separate it all out. But there are these nuances. So yes, I think that there would be a lot shared across this distance.
And a related question, a thought from another person, was how would you say that the Elnu might differ from the Nulhegan band?
It,
Looking very locally.
wow. In terms of hunting and fishing, um, not sure.
And if I could interject, because this is, a stimulating thought, a series of questions, but your expertise goes far beyond what anyone else in the room might have. But I'm thinking you have a combination, whether you're thinking about long distance between here and New Brunswick, or whether you're thinking locally within the state, you have people communicating with one another, inspiring one another. You have gifted artists and artisans who have greater or lesser skill at doing certain types of things. So you have people who become specialists in certain types of creativity, and you have other skills that are commonly shared across most members of a family or a society.
Correct.
And so I'm not sure that you can make those kinds of um, specific generalities, other than that people's response comes to where they're living, their activities are shaped by the landscape and resources around them. And so you will get some cultural variation. I would hesitate to, there is such depth of material culture and individual creativity. I don't know that you can make generalities of any people at any time period.
Yeah, but I've given that a lot of thought. I mean, when you asked that question, I went right back to everything I remember about the recognition petitions.
Yes.
And everything was just, crossing over so much. But nevertheless, there is a distinctive feel or
Mm-hmm.
style to each one of the tribes.
Yes.
That is a legacy of not only the current leadership, but former leadership.
Yes.
Missisquoi and Coas, very much a downtown
Mm-hmm.
settlement, you know, group with all the little cliques and the micro, ways that they handle within what's a geographer would call a barrio. Whereas El Nu and Milhegan, you get a more dispersed feel. And, I really haven't been able to quantify that or even explain it, but, I get it when I'm in Milhegan territory. There's certain feels, way the land feels, the way that people talk about agriculture mainly, because that's how I really got to know the people of those areas and stuff. So there is something there, but it's I've been so busy with the minutia of this, I really haven't tried to figure out how all the different tribes have slightly different styles. Some of them are quite spectacular.
Yes. And I think we should draw our conversation to a close. There are comments coming in that are a lot of expressions of appreciation for what you've been saying and what you have offered us. And there are certainly thanks to be offered both to you as our speaker and to the supporters who have made this series possible, including the Vermont Department of Health, who has sponsored the program, the audience for coming tonight,